Namaste. The greeting many folks know from yoga practice, pointing several fingers outward, thumbs to the center of the chest, a gesture of greeting that says, that within me, which is also a part of you, greets you. The physical gesture connects what's inside with what's outside, sending forth peace and blessing and welcome. I remember when I was first taught this gesture as a teenager at a church youth conference, thinking how exotic and profound and beautiful it was. So much better than our perfunctory greetings in the West. What must it be like, I wondered, to live in a culture where people are so very spiritually focused? Then I met someone from India many years later and asked him about it. It's just like a hello, he said, shrugging. You Westerners think everything we do is some big deal. It's not. He had a point. Who's to say that our greetings in the West are more shallow? Just perhaps that I might not have been mindful enough in general of what a profoundly important act a simple greeting was. I kept wondering how to carry that spirit, that essence of remembering that when I greeted someone, I wanted to be thinking of what part of us was shared, at least as much as what parts of us were different. We're taught so many things about the right way to welcome. Most of them so early in our lives, we don't really remember learning them at all. And some come from so far back in our cultural history that we don't know the story of how they came to be. When we greet our neighbors every Sunday morning, many of us start with a handshake for those we don't know well. Though it's become known around the world as a gesture of greeting, that handshake was thought to have originated in ancient Egypt, where it was believed that the gods transmitted their blessings to humans through the touch of a hand. And at various times later in history, it was part of a ritual greeting to assure a peaceful meeting, grabbing one another's forearms as a way to check for weapons up the sleeve. Many of us wouldn't think of greeting strangers without a handshake, but there are parts of the world in which it's really only used for business and seems stiff and formal for a first social meeting. And even that simple act in places where we think we are understanding each other and what the norm is can be fraught with complexity. President Obama got grief for fist bumping the First Lady at a major event early in his presidency. George W. Bush was criticized for not doing proper handshakes with world leaders. Who among us has not come away from some simple greeting put off by how firm or how limp a handshake was, or felt a little weary at how long one might have lasted? All that, and we haven't even had to open a door and let someone cross the threshold of our home, or make ourselves vulnerable by sharing something deep from within us. When it comes to greeting the stranger, we arrive with many stories and confusions. Places we know connection might have been possible but had no idea how to make it, or where connection was attempted and spurned. Those uncomfortable questions live alongside our vision of beloved community, that welcome table where all people are able to connect and share wisdom across all kinds of difference, where we're enriched, enhanced, grown by our ability to hold our oneness and our distinctiveness in live tension. Our fears and hesitations are constant challenges to our hopes, correctives to our thoughts that this work might be easy. I know I carry more of those stories than I can properly count, but one I'll share this morning lived with me as a deep knot in my belly for many years. It happened when I was 15. But it starts with the fact that when I was at 12 and in 7th grade, my family moved to a suburb of Columbus, Ohio, where I made what I thought was the best friend I would ever have in the world, as you only can when you're 12. The best of that group of best friends was a girl named Robin. We were tight. So when my family moved in the middle of 8th grade, just 18 months later, I was devastated. How in the world was I ever going to make such good friends again? Ever. I aggressively kept in touch with Robin, writing letters back and forth as fervently as we once had passed notes to each other in class. And Robin herself had moved in a few years to San Diego. And as luck would have it, my family was going on a road trip through Southern California. How great it would be if we could see each other, we thought. So we made arrangements, we two teenagers, and I called her from the place where my family was camping with friends 2 nights before we arrived in San Diego. "I can't wait to see you," she squealed. "You'll have to spend the night, of course." "Let me check with my parents," I said. "I don't know what their plans are." "Mom, Dad, Robin has invited us to stay over in San Diego. Can we please?" I asked. My not normally indulgent parents knew how much I'd missed my friends, and they reluctantly agreed. So off we went to San Diego. We pulled up in front of what to us looked like a huge, modern mansion in a manicured neighborhood. Robin and I greeted each other on the front walk with squeals of delight, and I told her my family was just going to take a minute to get their stuff out of the car. She looked at me puzzled, said, "They're getting out of the car?" I said, "Yeah, you invited us to stay over, remember?" "I invited you to stay over," she said. "Well, let me ask my mom if you all can stay." I was utterly embarrassed. Had no idea how I could have misunderstood what to me was a clear invitation. I was traveling with my family. And an invitation to you had to be plural, or it didn't make any sense, did it? Where would they stay? Robin's parents were quite put out by the request and explained to my father that they only had 3 bedrooms in the house for the 3 of them. My father, further embarrassing me, asked if they could just put their sleeping bags down on the living room floor. We had just been camping, after all. Shock and horror were mirrored on each set of parents' faces, as that too was vetoed. Directions to the nearest motel were given, an expense I knew wasn't in my family's budget for the trip. The plan had been to stop for a couple hours and then drive to another campsite before that invitation to stay over. My parents let me stay, but the knot in my stomach was enormous. I felt selfish, a traitor to my family for a friendship I was now less certain of than ever. The next day, my parents picked me up, and a few hours into the trip, after my sisters regaled me with the story of how nice the hotel was that they stayed in, while my mother fumed in the front seat, my father simply said, "I hope you know that our people always make room for guests." Later, I would overhear my parents arguing over the reasons for what they perceived to be rude behavior. For my Iranian father, it was the selfishness of Americans that explained it all. For my American mother, who was raised working class, it was their wealth that explained the lack of hospitality. For me, it was that I should have known better than to assume anything, and further evidence that my culturally strange and financially strapped family would always be misfits. I felt like a complete fool. Now, as a parent of a child who will be a teenager before I know it, living in the suburbs, I too would be put out by the request that a whole family stay with us without notice. I know that internal sigh of exhaustion at the thought of having to be on for people I barely know in my own home, and how much it takes to host even the most familiar of friends. I know that they were not meaning to be selfish or rude or unwelcoming. But I would bet that the story of that awkwardness is one that they tell with equal mystery and equal regret. And I'm willing to bet that you have a story of some awkward moment of meeting the stranger or being the stranger too. A situation where you weren't really sure what you should have done differently, or where your assumptions about how things should work out turned out to be completely wrong. Any of you have a story like that knocking around in your system? Don't worry, I won't ask you to tell it. We arrive at our encounters with strangers wishing to be seen fully, to be known for all of our good intentions, our desire to connect. And yet we hold these misgivings born of hard experience. And though we may have, and I would venture to guess that especially those of us who live with some level of privilege do have far more experiences of generous welcome and inclusion than of awkward exclusion. It's the tough experiences that keep us wary, don't they? Mythology and scripture around the world are full of that command to welcome the stranger, the moral lesson that lives in us as a big, fat should. And we carry that as a little bit of shame each time we find ourselves having to close the door or unable to open it quite wide enough to welcome that one who is asking for our time, for our attention, for our generosity. But I wonder what it might take for us to dwell a bit longer in the beauty of our good experiences than in the tough ones. What if we kept our eye on that ever-refilling bowl of food, the blessing of connection that keeps giving long after our guests have gone, no matter how awkward the visit was or how reluctant we initially might have been at the encounter? It might be as small and fleeting as the joy of a genuine smile of thanks from the person who has asked for change at the car window, or as profoundly humbling as the experience of being hosted generously in international travel by people who live for a month on what we might spend in a day. Radical hospitality. If we are to live it, it has to well up from the root of our beings, has to be grounded very literally, as it was for Bocchus and Philemon, in our spirit's need for connection. We're held firm in that spirit's foundation, that need to reach out and to bring in, to discover that love is our common source and our destination, not in sentimental platitudes, but in active experience of reaching past fear and self-doubt, of risking the awkward and the uncomfortable for the sake of an experience of grace. We have those opportunities all the time. We have that yearning deep in our soul to bring forth the wonder of connection. What if we were to live according to that yearning? What if we were to listen to the vulnerable places in ourselves and bring them forward to connect? This coming week is going to offer lots of opportunities for connection of this kind, as we share some of our cultural backgrounds with each other by bringing favorite foods to a potluck on Friday, as we welcome the travel team from our Leap of Faith partner congregation in Augusta, Maine, through a whole weekend of shared learning and partnership to a Sunday morning celebration of our shared faith. And all week, we'll have opportunities in our lives apart from church, too, to practice bringing in that wonder, to let those vulnerable places in our souls make the risk of connection, to bring forward something that's true and precious and real, and offer it to another. In the name of love, in the name of connection, in the name of God. Let's make our humble offerings to each other. Let the wonder wash over us again and again. Let us do so prayerfully, joyfully, tenderly, with each being we encounter. Amen.